tuning in. Stay tuned. We got another half an hour of music coming up.
Yes, that's my outro for the Dead Zone, which is on the air right now. And by the magic of pre-recorded, pre-produced radio, I'm in my study in Portland, Maine, and I'm also on the air on WRHU. And as soon as I find my place, I'll start reading the meditation for tonight. All right, so to pop that down. So we're up to, I think it's 46, PPM 46, chapter 4, making our the slow reading of the Allegory of the Cave. We've got a lot of focus on the Allegory as a blues, coming out of the tradition of the blues and having this resonance of the blues. And I wrote about and have talked about in the last two PPMs or recordings or commemorative videos here about the Allegory as as a story that comes out of the tradition of the blues, or is a crypto blues tale, I suppose. It isn't so far, as I was saying yesterday, that the people in the Allegory in the cave form a separate demos, right? And because they're separate from everyone else, that is to say, in particular, the puppeteers, those who are sort of orchestrating the theater of deception. Because if we think of them as having their own demos or being their own demos, then they are standing outside in some ways. And what I was suggesting yesterday was that in the tradition of the blues, the cave dwellers represent, they're in a state that's a sort of a middle state, and therefore it is like the middle passage. So it's in between a time of emancipation and a prior time of freedom. Now, I'm taking a lot of poetic license there because, of course, the way that the story begins is by Socrates saying they've been there since childhood. But I'm thinking of these oppressed people that are in the cave as part of a tradition. So before they were in the cave, so to speak, in the cave, chained to the wall, they were at some point free. And that freedom, their slavery and their oppression is a state that's in between the prior freedom and the freedom to come. So that's in what I was suggesting. So let's pick it up then. So we got through the first part of the story, which was a description of what's going on in the cave as far as these people sitting there in the cave. All right. The second part of the story begins with Socrates' account of the gradual releasement of the prisoners. He asked Glaucon to, quote, to consider what would happen if their release from their chains and the healing of their unwisdom should come about in this way. The way will be decisive as a turning around, paideia, which is the essence of education as the releasement or liberation into freedom. I'm going to say that again. The way will be decisive, a turning around, paideia, which is the essence of education as the releasement or liberation into freedom. We will have more to say about this when we reflect further on the story. For now, it is important to recognize that in the second part of the story, we encounter an event that is akin to the initial calling of evocative speech we have been discussing. An unnamed, unidentified source enters the scene and releases one of the prisoners from his chains and compels him to turn around and observe the reality of his surroundings. This releasement This releasement and turning around is painful, and the process of liberation gets underway is described throughout as an arduous process that must be endured. Again, this is not unlike the process we have been describing as the initial moments of learning, where the evocative questioning distorts and estranges the apprentice from his habitual habitat, and is experienced first and foremost as an irritation and a provocation. Here in Plato's Allegory, the one who is released is forced to stand up and compelled to turn around. The releasement then is gradual, not simply because the removal of the chains and the physical adjustments are necessarily slow and painful, which they are, but also gradual in the sense that the mysterious liberator is slow to relinquish the role of oppressor. Assuming, as we must, that the one who is releasing the prisoner is someone who has, as they say, committed class suicide, or abandoned their position as a central cast member in the theater of oppression. Despite the fact that Plato gives us little indication of the identity of the source responsible for the liberation of the prisoner, we will return to this element of the story. It is crucially important to our questions concerning the origin of the call to get learning underway. For the moment, we listen to Socrates take us through the second part of the story. Quote, "Suppose one of them was set free and forced suddenly to stand up, turn his head, and walk with eyes lifted to the light. All these movements would be painful, and he would be too dazzled to make out the objects whose shadows he's been used to see. What do you think he would say if someone told him that he had formerly seen was a meaningless illusion, but now, being somewhat nearer to reality and turned towards more real objects, he was getting a truer view? Suppose further that he were shown the various objects being carried by and were made to say, in reply to questions, what each of them was. Would he not be perplexed and believe that the objects now shown him to be not so real as they were formerly, as he saw them formerly?" Socrates asked. "Yes, not nearly so real," Glaucon replied. "And if he were forced to look at the firelight itself, would not his eyes ache, so that he would try to escape and turn back to the things which he could see distinctly, convinced that they really were clearer than these other objects now being shown to him?" Socrates. "Yes, Glaucon." Republic, 515d through e. Part 2 of the story depicts the confusion, disorientation of the one who has received the saying of evocative speech. This part of the tale also emphasizes the give and take between the one who is being released and the one who is releasing. The releasement occurs when the prisoner is made to stand up and look at the objects whose shadows were all he previously knew. He's forced to look at the fire whose light cast the shadows on the wall. This is a painful process that slowly but surely dismantles all that he had believed to be reality. It's not so much that the shadows are no longer real. Rather, the reality of these shadows has been placed within a much more complicated and larger context. For the first time, these shadows are understood as shadows, and thus regarded in their proper manner. The turning has produced the proper regard of these beings. This proper regard indicates the comportment of attunement or contemplation of beings that as they appear within our horizon, as part of a complex context or web of meaning. We'll have more to say about this proper regard that is initiated in part 2 of this turning. Here we should emphasize that the give and take between liberator and liberated should not be considered arbitrary or the fortunate outcome of chance. The offering of liberation, the gift of teachability, is made by one who can make this offering. We can only truly offer what we actually have to give, as in this important moment in the allegory. Further, we can only truly accept what we are ready to receive. This initial response to the story is meant to have us wonder what may have prepared the prisoner to endure the pain of his releasement, and to ask where the liberator received the gift she is passing on. These questions may appear as evocative, for they do not easily produce an answer, and take us into the realm of pure speculation. And this is the poetic nature of this philosophical allegory. If we authentically hear it, we are propelled into speculation, interpretation. The second part of the story only depicts the initial turning, but this originary moment shows that learning is not postponed or delayed, but gets underway at the instant when the liberator turns away from her position as a performer in the theater of illusion and manipulation and turns toward the outre, who is located in chains below her. And this indicates why learning is a beginning that gets underway, because the teacher and apprentice are always already prepared to offer and receive teachability. The gift is available, the cup ready to be passed. The give and take awaits only the spontaneous act of offering, of turning away from one's habitual habitat and towards the other. So as I've said a couple of times, my initial response is, I kind of like it. I definitely enjoyed writing this part of, I enjoyed this writing. When I was made the move to the Allegory and remember, this is a commemoration of something I wrote 10 years ago, and it was an experiment, and it was at that point just an experiment, write every day, pursuing wherever the questions and the thoughts and the text would take me. And by March the 30th, I was well on my way to a very slow and careful reading of the Allegory of the Cave from Book 7 of Plato's Republic. And I do recall that once I got into that, because the Allegory of the Cave, I've talked about certain stones, fragments, important concepts, and important sentences, quotations, and words that I've sort of dropped continuously, and I've gotten away from that at this point in chapter 4 because I'm focusing on the Allegory of the Cave. But in chapters 1 and 2, and then again in even some in 3, I was repeating phrases and building on terms. One example being the question, how is it with the nothing, which I borrowed from Heidegger. The Allegory of the Cave is over a whole lifetime of the study of philosophy, one of those stones. So it is probably that first text, if I haven't already mentioned it, I'll mention it here, was that first text that I read and studied in the first class of philosophy I had at Fordham that really just sort of framed and oriented almost everything that I would read afterwards. And so at this point, as I brought back and sort of dropped this stone, and it could, in some sense, it's a boulder because of its size and the magnitude of it for me as someone who studies and talks about and writes and does philosophy, it's pretty important. So at this point in the writing, I was definitely settling in for a while. Now, a couple of things that are highlights here is, paideia. I think this may be the first time that Greek term enters in, and paideia is the key term in the Allegory of the Cave because it describes the turning that's happening. So paideia is a Greek word for education, and it really is the word that I could have brought in at the very beginning of the writing, because when I talk about being turned around to being presencing, the word is paideia. When I quoted Plato at the very beginning of the writing, and he got me going on this, the question is not whether or not we can have an effacement or contemplate being's presencing, but whether or not we can do it. The question is if we will do it, and then the question that's begged is, well, if we're going to do it, how can we get turned around to it? And so being turned around then is paideia. And education then, this is why the book and the work is called Being and Learning, because the turning, that is education, turns us towards being, and when we encounter being's presencing, we are learning, right? So or we are being educated. As a side note, I'm really not I understand there's a discourse around learning today, but I have this ongoing debate with some of my colleagues in the philosophy of education field about the term learning. And to me, it's just another way of saying to be educated or being educated. And perhaps being educated is a better way of putting it, because it captures the ontology of the relationship between being and the human being. But I like the term learning, and I just like the way it flows. Being and learning. ING. It's a verb. And so it captures that. And so paideia then is a key term that is dropped in this meditation, and it's the key to understanding the allegory, and therefore, and Heidegger makes this point over and over again in his essay, which I've kind of moved away from, but which has sort of brought me in there. The other thing I wanted to point out was that when Socrates begins this section, as I call it, he says, consider what would happen if they're released from the chains and the healing of their own wisdom should come about in this way. And I like this because there can be sort of is like the plural. So it follows from this notion of the cave dwellers as a demos. So even though the focus is going to be on one prisoner being released, and that works well for me, as I wrote about here, because it really helps to focus on this dialogic relationship between the liberator and this mysterious one. We don't know where they came from, so I just speculate that they were one of the puppeteers, and that's open for discussion, and I'll come back to that actually. But the relationship between the liberator and the one who's being liberated. So it's this nice sort of dialogic relationship, one-on-one. And I think, to me, that's important insofar as thinking, as I'm using it, borrowing it from Arendt, is this two-in-one, right? So the two-in-one, me amautu, she is the Greek term, me amautu, E-M-E-M-A-U-T-O, the two-in-one dialogue. So the focus of a two-in-one, a two that makes one, then becomes sort of like the principle or the reduction of the learning community. So it's the many, the plurality, that form the one. So e pluribus unum, a many that is a one. That's the learning community. But that gets reduced to, in a certain sense, the two-in-one, right? So it all comes down to, like, the single along with the group. So let's say one person, the sage, for example, raising the question, or one member of the learning community taking a solo, speaking, because we have to sort of take turns. It's not. It could be polyphonic. There could be many voices at the same time speaking, and that's what my doctoral dissertation was about, actually. But in this case, it's a taking of turns, right? And so there's always a one in relationship to a many. And that one in relationship to many then is this two-in-one, but in a larger sort of macroscopic field. Right, I think I'm going to leave it at that. I'm trying to stay with under 20 minutes for brevity here. And then, I just hope that this was from March the 30th, and it corresponds to pages in Chapter 4 of Being and Learning. And so you can hunt for those, or perhaps when I do my write-up, I'll include the page numbers on that. And the dead zone's still on. Chicken nugget.
Sunshine Daydream.
Now, what's interesting about the coincidence of this is if I were reading the third part, where the prisoner is released out of the cave, then this would be, of course, so timely. But Sunshine Daydream. Okay. Still, it kind of works. Okay. I keep pushing stop, honestly. So you probably already turned it off by now. Okay, until tomorrow.